So today we're going to talk about case studies. So we recommend that you read this article from AOTA's website that guided some of our thinking before you begin watching. It's listed below for your convenience. It's called A Case for Case Study Research. So let's review this article before we begin. So a few reasons why to use a case study is because the OT process is highly individualized and a case study is comprehensive. Case studies are also really good to link process-based interventions with patient performance or to study a phenomenon and the context in which it occurs. And then a quick overview of the process of using a case study, which will go more into depth later in our presentation, is that cases can be singular or multiple using replication logic, and data can be qualitative and or quantitative. Some of the data may include formal OT measurements, interviews, or informal data like observations or conversations.
So some learning objectives before we begin is to understand the definition and characteristics of a case study, gain an understanding of why case studies are appropriate for OT, be able to explain how case studies differ from other kinds of studies, be able to list the strengths and weaknesses of a case study, and apply and demonstrate the process of conducting a case study. And lastly, conceptualize a case study in relation to your project. Next, test your knowledge. So here is a baseline practice test. These are 4 questions, true or false. I'm going to read through them if you want to take a minute to write your answers as we go. Number 1, case studies can be used to explore a policy or business. 2, case studies require a hypothesis and research questions. 3, it is inappropriate to use theory when exploring an individual's unique case. And 4, case study is usually not a methodology in its own, it is more of an approach. Now that you have answered these questions, we can go ahead and go over the answers. Number 1 was true. Number 2 was true. 3 is false. And 4 is true. Here is a little case study video. This video is going to provide you with a brief overview of what exactly a case study is to prepare you for the rest of this webinar.
In this Research Methods in Psychology video, we're going to cover the use of case studies. We'll discuss what's included in the definition of a case study and describe a few examples of famous case studies. The strengths and weaknesses of using a case study in psychological research will also be covered. Psychboost.com, over 170 videos to help you with your qualification, and Patreon supporters can access bonus resources, tutorial videos, and the Discord channel. In a case study, a researcher gathers a range of information on an individual, a group, or an organisation. Interviews are often the main source of data collected, but the researcher can include observations of behaviour and even experimental findings from psychological tests, and even include content analysis on records like diaries. Now, what makes case studies special is the level of detail that's collected about the individual or the group. Case studies tend to be investigations of psychologically unusual individuals, but you can do case studies of events, such as looking for the reasons for football violence by reviewing footage and interviewing criminals and police. Or you could do case studies on organisations, such as the hiring policies of Google or the teaching at outstanding schools. You may even do a case study on a group of typical members of a demographic, like a group of 15-year-old working class boys. The type of data collected is usually qualitative, information in the form of words, because of the use of interviews. But when the researchers include experimental techniques, quantitative data in the form of numbers, can be used to back up qualitative findings. The duration of a case study can be a couple of hours, a few days, or years to decades. A short case study is called a snapshot, and a long case study is called a longitudinal study. Now, longitudinal studies are particularly interesting because you can observe changes over time. But as you can imagine, it's expensive to keep longitudinal studies funded over many years. Case studies have been used significantly in clinical psychology. Brain damage patients often have unusual symptoms, and this gives an insight on the functioning of the brain. Now, for example, Paul Broca researched a patient referred to as Tan. Now, this patient could only say Tan, and work while Tan was alive was combined with post-mortem dissection of his brain after his death. And this work led to the identification of Broca's area, a part of the brain responsible for speech production. Freud used a number of case studies to develop psychodynamics, and the most famous was Little Hans. This young boy had a phobia of horses that Freud identified as being symbolic of his fear of his father. And Freud conducted this case study by sending a series of letters to his father and used this case study to support his theory of childhood development. Case studies of children with abnormal upbringings can be used to test the ideas of childhood development. And one famous example is the case of a child called Jeannie, who was severely deprived of care from infancy until 13. Now, even with the help of trained psychologists, she was unable to develop beyond simple communication and struggled to behave appropriately. Jeannie demonstrated the importance of early years and critical periods of childhood in learning language and social skills. Evaluations of case studies. We can positively evaluate case studies easily. There just isn't another method that collects as much in depth and rich information about individuals. This leads to a high level of realism that can be argued to be highly valid. Psychologists call this approach holistic, understanding a behavior or individual not just from one perspective but from a range. It's the preferred approach of a group of psychologists called the humanists. As I've said, case studies often look at the behavior of very rare individuals. This behavior and the participant situations can't be replicated in the lab. Jeannie's situation, for example, could never be ethically replicated. And this means that case studies are often the only way to study certain behaviors. And another strength is just one unusual case study can show a pre-existing psychological theory is incorrect, or maybe just not yet complete. But there are critical evaluations of case studies. Most of these critical evaluations question the scientific nature of case studies. For example, case studies are often completed long after events and depend heavily on memory. So what's recorded in interviews is often inaccurate. And you have the other problems of interviews like social desirability bias. Being studies of often one unique individual, the findings from case studies cannot be generalized to wider populations. It might be a range of factors of that individual that cause a certain behavior, rather than, for example, damage to a particular part of the brain. Now, linked to this point is the exact replication of case studies is impossible. And while the amount of data collected is large, this presents another problem. Sometimes more data is collected than can actually be used. And the researcher ultimately decides what to include in the report, and might only include data that supports their ideas. Now, this is one example of researcher bias. Another way case studies suffer from researcher bias is as the researchers work so closely with a case, often over many years, they may lose objectivity when interpreting behavior. And while case studies shouldn't be generalized and lack the scientific credibility of experimental methods, they can generate hypotheses that can be tested empirically and then ultimately accepted. Well over 100 years after Paul Broca and Tan's death, we now can use fMRI scans to confirm the existence of the region of the brain associated with speech production. So that was case studies. I have 6 tutorial videos covering the 2017, 18, and 19 AS and A-level research method sections. And these videos have worked examples to every question and are full of exam tips. Patrons at the Neural
So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the origins of case studies. So in 1829, Laplace, a French sociologist and economist, used a case study while examining the economic conditions in the working class. And then in 1836, Charles Darwin's famous case that you probably know was published on his experiences in the Galapagos. In 1909, Freud published his first case study on abnormal behavior and mental illness. And then in 1984, case studies were introduced in the education field. In 1995, case study was identified as one of the primary research methods in qualitative research.
So there's fields in which case studies are commonly used, and here are 3: social science, education, and psychology. It is important to know that case studies are used in a wide variety of fields. Another example could be business. As mentioned in the earlier video we just watched was Jeannie. This is an example of a case study used in psychology. On the next slide, you will learn more about Jeannie, the famous case study in psychology, and Phineas Gage, which is another famous case study. So as mentioned,
in 1848, Phineas Gage is working on a railroad in Cavendish. He's packing the powder down with the tamping iron, blowing up rocks. The charge detonates prematurely, and this tamping iron, this 3-foot 7-inch, 13.5-pound tamping iron, fires into Phineas Gage's head. It enters into his left cheek, it passes behind his left eye, it severs his optic nerve, and then comes out his forehead and lands 30 yards away. Phineas Gage was able to survive, having a 3-foot 7-inch bar shot transcranially through his head. In 1850, Henry Jacob Bigelow, who's the professor of surgery at Harvard Medical School at the time, brought Gage and John Harlow, his doctor, to Harvard for an examination. Bigelow essentially concludes that this man did have a giant iron bar shot through his head and did survive, and he publishes the case in 1850. After the accident, Phineas Gage goes from businesslike and efficient to no longer able to follow through with his plans. He becomes the textbook case for post-traumatic personality change. And that's why you find him in a lot of the modern medical, neuroscience, psychology literature. Phineas Gage has been at Harvard Medical School for 160 years. So in many ways, I see him similarly to how you would see one of the famous professors who hang on the wall. He's an important part of Harvard Medical School's identity. And by continually reflecting on his case, it allows us to continually change how we want to understand the human brain and how we interact with our historical understanding of neuroscience.
Hello folks, today's story is about the story of Jeannie, a feral child. Meet Jeannie. She suffered some of the worst child abuse recorded in the history of the United States. She was born to deranged parents. She was held captive, starved, tormented, and strapped to a homemade straitjacket for 13 years in her bedroom, deprived of human interaction and social stimulation, until she was thrust into the public spotlight and under the gaze of researchers and academics. Her dad, who forbade everyone in the family from caring for her, had temper issues, hated noise, never wanted children, and lacked care for others. Whereas her mom was abused, conflicted, suffered from cataracts, and was the one who occasionally fed Jeannie. If Jeannie had made any noise whatsoever, her dad would beat her with a baseball bat. She was never spoken to and therefore never had the opportunity to develop any language. She would communicate only in moans and cries. One day, while her mom was driving to social service for disability benefits, the social worker felt suspicious of Miss Wiley and called the police. The police arrived and Jeannie was finally freed and studied by researchers. It was evident and disclosed to the public that Jeannie was socially isolated, strapped to her toilet or crib, without stimulation of any kind, and severely malnourished, preventing key brain regions from developing. It was then discovered by these researchers that although Jeannie was 13 years of age, physically she was the size of a 6-year-old, and her brain was the size of a 3-year-old. Regions like the prefrontal cortex that deals with planning and higher cognitive functions, left and right hemispheres, logical and artistic thinking respectively, and the Broncos area that focuses on language, never had the chance to come into fruition or to develop completely. So what did I learn from the story of Jeannie? 1. Focus on developing key brain regions that need development. So articulate your thoughts, enjoy solving problems, think creatively. And 2. focus on consuming healthy food. Healthy body means healthy mind. And thirdly, surround yourself in a loving, nurturing, and enriching environment. And last, enjoy learning. So, where is Jeannie now, you may ask? Well, currently, Jeannie is a ward of the state of California, living in an undisclosed location in Los Angeles. So, in the words of Professor Jordan Peterson, keep your calm, read about great people, write so you can think, and talk so you can speak. We have a lot to be grateful about when we read about the story of Jeannie, and we can only wish the best.
Well, as you can see, those are very important cases that have shaped the concepts in psychology. So what is a case study? So first, case studies are known as the study of an instance in action. So an approach in which the investigator explores a real-life contemporary bounded system, a case, or multiple bounded systems, cases, over time. This involves detailed, in-depth data collection from multiple sources of information. This can include observations, interviews, audiovisual material, documents, and reports. Case studies are used to illustrate more general principles through case description and case themes. Case studies can be used to establish cause and effect relationships and spark a new idea. Case studies can be qualitative or quantitative and are methodologically eclectic.
So, a few characteristics of case studies. They're bounded. This means that they're focused and narrow in scope. They have clear boundaries of the amount of people that are going to be in the study, the observations made, or the documents reviewed. They're holistic. This means that they seek to understand the whole picture and the relationships between the parts of the case. They're contextual, which means that it includes a vast account of the context. And they're naturalistic, which means that it explores an event or phenomenon in depth in its natural context in comparison to other types of experimental designs like a randomized control trial where it's not in their natural environment. So here are a few times where a case study could be really helpful. So case studies can be used to explain, describe, or explore events or phenomenons in the everyday context in which they occur. So a few examples of case studies. You can use a case study to describe in detail a patient's episode of care, to explore professional attitudes and experiences of a new policy initiative, or to investigate a contemporary phenomenon within its real-life context.
So case studies versus other designs. What differentiates case studies from other research designs? So it's important to know that they're more focused on the subject. Situations should speak for themselves rather than being largely evaluated or judged by the researcher. So other research designs are weak in reality, but can be easily organized, versus case study data is strong in reality, but may be difficult to organize and pick the most important parts. Case studies are less distinguished by methodology and more by the subject they observe. Unlike other studies which manipulate variables or ask standardized questions, case study research observes characteristics. Case studies explain the links between interventions that are too complex for surveys or experimental strategies.
So now we're going to touch on some of the strengths and weaknesses of case studies. So the video that we showed in the beginning kind of touched on these subjects, but we're going to go a little in depth. But before I begin, as we were reading the literature, we found that there is a lot of debate about the strengths and weaknesses of case studies. It's a very polarized topic, and many either think they're amazing or not so much. So in terms of strengths, case studies are flexible. So researchers, they can have many different research goals, approaches, and philosophical positions. And case studies, they can be traditional and cutting edge in methodology. As we said before, case studies, they're in-depth and they're very, very holistic. So they allow for specificity of a particular phenomena, and they allow for the ability to show multiple perspectives and diverse points of view. And they really look at a phenomena as they occur in their real context, which is very important, especially in OT. Case studies are thorough. You can really understand the complexity of a particular context. They involve multiple sources and techniques in data collection. So whether you're collecting interviews or observations, you can really gather lots of information through a case study, which allows for in-depth descriptions of the data that you have collected. Case studies are also responsive, meaning that they're going to document processes of change as they occur. As you're following a case, you can really detect challenges, and you can embrace uncontrolled variables, which you cannot do in other kinds of methodologies and anticipated events. You can really embrace those as they occur within a case study. Also, case studies have a wide appeal. So case studies, they can be written for a variety of audiences. More people are likely to understand and be able to follow a case study. Whereas if you receive information from like a quantitative study, that might be harder to understand than a case. So they're really easier for the general population to read and understand. Now, in terms of weaknesses, for case studies, the results are not always generalizable, and that's because case studies are very specific. Furthermore, if you're only looking at a single case, the results can be too narrow. And then some may say that there's a lack of scientific rigor because there's that inability to generalize and transfer information to other studies. Another weakness of case studies, they're eclectic in nature. Usually case studies are mixed with other approaches, which can lead to almost a messy and confusing project because you have so much information. Always there's the potential for bias. So with a case study, if you're following a person, you're relying on their memory. And in terms of the researcher, there's bias depending on what information you decide to include. Another weakness is the boundness of a case. Although that is a strength, it can also be a weakness because sometimes those boundaries are hard to predict or manage. And finally, a weakness of a case study can be the high volume of data. So as the video that we showed in the beginning was saying, case studies can be longitudinal and go on for a very long time. So you can receive lots and lots and lots of information, and that can be tricky to deal with. In relation to case studies and their importance in OTs, so case studies and the OT process, both of them are very highly individualized. So that is a similarity between case studies and OT. Case studies themselves, they're comprehensive, and they can help explore the multiple variables that constitute the OT process. So as we all know, OT is very client-centered. We're holistic. We really want to look at the person, their environment, their roles, and a case study really allows for you to go in depth and take a client-centered approach and explore all those variables that influence occupation, like exploring clients within their context. So case studies are also useful when the boundaries between a phenomena and a context are not clearly evident. So once again, they really help you explore your client and where they are, what they're at, what they're doing. So furthermore, in relation to OT, case studies have a big relation to theory, as we've been learning about in Terry's class. So case studies, they examine the relationship between people and structures in which they work, live, and learn, and acknowledges that the dynamics of interaction must be the starting point for research. So you really begin case studies kind of with theory. So you want to consider the theories that are relevant to your case, and these theories will help you shape your analysis once you gather the data from your case study. So these theories, they can be individualistic. Maybe you're using a developmental theory or cognitive behavioral. Maybe you're looking at group theories. If you're doing like a business or a school system or family, You can use like dynamic systems theory. You can look at a work team or a family. You can use organizational theories, which focus on structure and function, or you can even use societal theories, which might focus on things like urban development, institutions, or technology. Now, within case study research, hypotheses are also called theoretical propositions. So you will typically begin with a theoretical proposition or hypothesis before beginning your case study. And case study research uses the concept of rival theories to recognize that typically more than one theory exists to explain how or why a set of variables are uniquely related under specific conditions. So sometimes you may find more than one theory is relevant to your case. And this is an important idea because other types of research designs may have a null hypothesis, but a case study does not. So that's why rival theories are important within the realm of case studies.
So now we're going to discuss the case study process and how to make your own case study. So this is just a brief overview of how to conduct a case study, and then we'll go into depth about each step. So the first step is to identify the case. This includes the study questions, which you use the literature to make, and your study propositions. So these reflect theoretical issues. The second step is to choose your approach and collect data. So you want to determine who you're studying, what your data is going to be. And then you want to interpret your data and write the narrative. So you're linking the data back to your study propositions, and you're going to interpret the findings in a narrative. So the first step, identify the case. So to identify the case, you want to select what problem or activity is the object of your study. To do this, you're going to look at the current literature, theoretical issues, and the setting that you want to do your study in. And then you're going to refine your research questions and then bind the case. As we were talking about earlier, case studies are bounded. So this means that you have to think about the location, the context, and the populations that you're going to study. A defined boundary means a lot of things. So you want to think about the nature and time period of your study, the relevant social groups, geographical location, the types of evidence you're going to collect, the priorities for data collection and analysis, and the defining theory that's going to guide your research. Also, important things to consider when you're planning your case study. You need to always remember ethics, the possibility that your participants may be harmed, there might be disruption to their lives or risk. You need to think about how you're going to get access to a specific site and to people and to data. Negotiating ownership of the data is important because participants need to have rights to be able to veto what the researchers interpret in the data because it's very personal and holistic. Secondly, you're going to choose your approach and collect your data. So when choosing a case study research approach, you need to remember that case studies are often not methodologies on their own. So blending case studies with other approaches makes it more holistic, specific, contextual, descriptive, and concrete. And the case study will be approached in a different way depending on the standpoint of your research. So here's 3 common approaches that people take when conducting case study research. So the first is the critical approach. This is when the researcher is questioning their own and others' assumptions. And then there's the interpretivist approach. This is when the researcher is trying to understand individual and shared social meanings. And then there's the positivist approach, which is focusing on generalizability considerations of a phenomenon. In the literature, there's 2 main researchers that have made classifications and types of case studies. So there's Stake, who published his work in 2003, and Yin, who published his work in 2009. And they both describe case studies in different ways and the types. So Stake's classifications are intrinsic, instrumental, and collective. And Yin's classifications are exploratory, descriptive, and explanatory. And we're going to go into depth about each of those now. So one of Stake's types of case studies is intrinsic. So in intrinsic case studies, the focus is on the case rather than a generic phenomenon. So it's used to learn about something unique. So these are the cases like the videos we watched. The case was really interesting. So the case is selected on its own merits because of the uniqueness, which is of genuine interest to the researchers. It's not to prove a theory or a point. So an example of this is evaluating a school curriculum by studying a student who's having difficulty because the case presents an unusual or unique situation. Another one of Stake's types of case studies is instrumental. So in this one, it's the opposite of the intrinsic. So the focus is on a general issue or concern, and then the researcher selects a bounded case to illustrate the issue. So this allows a researcher to refine a theory about a given instance, and the case is used to support the theory, but it's not the main focus as it is in intrinsic. The case isn't selected because of uniqueness, but because it allows the researcher to investigate the issue that they want to. So an example of this is if a researcher wants to study student culture in OT school, they may use a case of OT students at Elizabethtown College because of the easy access they have to the school. And lastly, there's the collective case study. So this studies multiple cases simultaneously or sequentially to generate a broader appreciation of a particular issue. So the number of these cases are carefully selected, and this type of case study offers the advantage of allowing comparisons to be made across several cases. So choosing a typical case may enable the findings to be generalized to test a theory or to create a theory. So for example, when studying what contributes most to wartime PTSD, a researcher could use a collective case study to compare the experiences of multiple veterans.
So although Stake and Yin both have different approaches, there are lots of similarities, which you will see as I describe Yin's process. But within Yin's process, it has two separate steps in a sense. So first, he delineates that you choose your approach, and then you choose how many subjects you would like to examine. So in terms of the approach, the first one is an exploratory case study. So this is undertaking fieldwork and data collection before deciding and defining research questions. So an exploratory case study can be done simply to explore. It's kind of an early phase or like the pilot case study. They're really kind of ambiguous and it answers the who or what. So for example, maybe a researcher is interested in maybe what kind of students are going to apply to an OT program. And this is similar to Stake's instrumental approach. Then you have your descriptive case studies, and these are detailed accounts of the subject of a study, kind of like the Genie case. So they're very comprehensive, and they comprehensively describe the context in which the individual is in. And they may lack appropriate theory grounding, as the case may be chosen just because it is so unique, like Genie, as I said, or Phineas Gage. And his last approach is explanatory. So an explanatory case study is used when researchers, they want to explain something or find a cause and effect relationship. So they aim to make explicit a problem or pattern of difficulties that relates to the given context. So they may locate patterns and organize them to kind of make sense of the complex case. So really that cause and effect to answer the how or why. So unlike an exploratory, which is kind of ambiguous, it's the beginning stages, the explanatory case, you really want to find a reason for something. Why is it happening? What's causing it? So for example, maybe there's a nutritionist who has a program and she's going to explore how it affects her clients. You have the cause and you're looking at the effect. So the next step with Yin, once you just decide if you're doing exploratory, descriptive, or explanatory, next, just kidding, surprise, we're going to test your knowledge. Okay, so I'm going to read these questions. Feel free to pause and write your response, and then at the end, I will share the answers, but don't lose that thought. We will soon return to Yin's second step. Okay, so first, what would this be? Why are college students addicted to their phones? Maybe you want to look at their family history, their hobbies, their usage, who students spend time with. Number 2, what kind of teaching styles exist amongst professors in academia? Number 3, you want to do a case study that accounts the subcultures that exist in an urban neighborhood. And number 4, you want to conduct a case study and look at what effects a drug prevention program has on high schoolers. So the answers, number 1 is going to be explanatory. Number 2 is going to be exploratory. That's kind of like a beginning question. What kind of teaching styles exist? You're beginning, it's ambiguous. Number 3 would be descriptive. You're looking at a specific cases, an account of subcultures. And number 4 would be explanatory. You're doing that cause and effect kind of relationship. Okay, now back to what I was saying before I surprised you with those questions. So once you know what your case is and its type, whether that's exploratory, explanatory, or descriptive according to Yin, you can identify whether your case study is a single or multiple case study design. So there's kind of 4 different classifications which are depicted in this graph. So you can have a single case design, which is holistic, a single case design, which is embedded, a multiple case design, which is holistic, and a multiple case design, which is embedded. And I will explain what those mean in 1 second. So take a moment to look at this diagram and then I'll break it down for you. So single case, like it sounds, you're looking at one case. And this can be because the case itself is critical, it's unique, it's representative of a broader population, it's longitudinal, it's revelatory. So these are those cases that are really unique. Once again, to reference Jeannie, that's not something you can really replicate. That's going to be a single case. Multiple case design, like it sounds, again, you're going to look at more than a single case. And these kinds of case studies are considered more robust because they do have evidence from multiple cases. So once you have either you want to do single or multiple, you need to decide if it's going to be holistic or embedded. So holistic means basically that all the data and resulting inferences, they pertain to one case, kind of one condition, one context. For example, maybe you're working with a client and you're really just analyzing data from one OT session that you had with that client. Versus an embedded case study, you're going to look at multiple elements and explore multiple units of the case and multiple layers of the context. So maybe you're looking at 8th graders in a high school, but you need to gather information from their teachers. You need to gather information about their grades, information about their social circles. So that's embedded because there are so many different elements. So in relation to our project, because that was definitely a lot of information, we kind of analyzed what we're doing in relation to both Stake and Yin's approaches. So just a refresher, what we are doing is we are implementing a sensory motor play group for children at Connections within the Bridge program who kind of display challenging behaviors. So in relation to Stake, we are conducting a case study using a collective approach because we're looking at multiple different children and how they are going to respond to a sensory motor program. And then in relation to Yin's approach, so we're going to do, the first step is explanatory because we're going to look at cause and effect, kind of the relationship between the sensory motor protocol and how it affects students and their challenging behaviors in the classroom. And then in terms of the second step of Yin's process, it's going to be multiple case because we're looking at more than one student, and it's going to be embedded rather than holistic because we're acquiring information from parent reports, teacher reports, and assessment information. So that kind of just relates all of that information back to what we're doing, and keep that in mind because we're going to have you do that for a fun little activity at the end. Stay tuned.
So now we're going to talk about data collection and case study before you get to do your interactive activity. So in case studies, there's a wide variety of data that can be collected. You can use quantitative data, qualitative, or both, like we're going to do in ours. And you can also use multiple sources of data, which increases the internal validity because you are using data triangulation. And this can also help to show a more holistic picture of a phenomenon with conclusions from different angles. Some common data sources in case studies are documents, archival records, interviews, direct observation, participant observation, physical artifacts like pictures. And we also found this article for you to stop and read. You can pause the video. So this is a clinical example in OT of a case study being used. So this article is titled Tailoring to Support Digital Technology Mediated Occupational Engagement for Older Adults, a multiple case study. So as I just said, this is a multiple case study. They're looking at 9 cases of older adults to see how tailoring the occupation may help them to be more successful in using digital technology. So this is collective. They're viewing the experiences of each participant to better understand this issue or phenomenon, and it's exploratory because they're seeing how tailoring can support their engagement. The methods used in this case study is qualitative. They didn't use any quantitative. They used questionnaires, observations, and dialogues. So they did use multiple sources of data collection. So it does have a lot of internal validity.
So now interpret the data and write the narrative. So for this, there's 5 analytic techniques. So first, there's pattern matching, and this is when it compares outcomes for variables to original proposition and looks for patterns to strengthen the analysis. 2 would be explanation building, and this is determine causal links about how or why something happened. You're trying to make the causal links reflect theoretically significant propositions, and this can lead to new insights in public policy or social science. 3 is time series analysis, and this traces those changes over time. 4, logic models. This is a chain of events over an extended period of time. A dependent variable in an earlier stage becomes the independent variable for the next stage. It's repeated the cause-effect pattern. And lastly, the cross-case synthesis. Analysis starts to probe whether different groups or cases appear to share something similar and could be considered the same type of a general case. So next, we will talk about the do's. So analyze the data relating to the individual component cases before making those comparisons across cases. So you want to include context. The attention needs to be paid to variations within each case, and where relevant, the relationship between the different causes and effects and outcomes. The data should be organized and coded to have the key issues easily retrieved. You can use those theoretical models to guide the emerging themes. Next, we will discuss the don'ts. So derive those theories from low-level data, collectively report information in journalism when you pick out those most striking features. Next, we will discuss writing the actual case narrative. So the format of how a researcher writes up their case study, this depends on the norms of the approach they decide to choose. It could be a suspense structure where the author presents the main findings in the opening part of the report and then devote the remainder to provide evidence, analysis, and explanations. It could be a narrative report. These are prose account of the individual with relevant figures and tables. It can be a comparative structure. The same case is examined through different lenses, such as exploratory, descriptive, and theoretical. And then chronological structure. This is a timeline in which those events occur. The appraisal of a case study. So these are some questions to ask yourself to assess a case study. Is there a clear identification of the case or cases in the study? Is the case used to understand a research issue or used because the case has intrinsic merit? Is there a clear description of the case? Are themes identified for the case? Are assertions or generalizations made from the case analysis? And is the researcher reflexive or self-disclosing about his or her position in the study? Reliability and validity. So there's construct validity, and this includes multiple sources of evidence. Internal validity is the pattern matching, explanation building, logic models, rival explanations. External validity would then be the use of the theory and replication logic. And reliability, this would be when you follow a case study database.
So now I'm just going to discuss some of the current trends in case studies. So as we talked about before, case studies have been long recognized in the business and law fields and in psychology. It hasn't been as recognized in previous years in healthcare, but is now emerging as a more used research method in healthcare because of interesting cases that may arise. A unique case may call for a case study so that if a patient comes into a facility with a similar case, a physician or healthcare provider can read on a case study to help them know the best form of care. And case studies have been a rapid growing method choice over the last few decades because of the flexibility and how much they offer to research, because you can use so many different forms of data.
Okay, so now it is time for our active learning assignment. So I want you to go on to Canvas, and there is a document there, and that this is a worksheet that you can kind of follow along with as I'm talking. And it's called "What's the Potential Face of Your Case?" So exciting, I know. So as we said before, case studies, they can be part of an eclectic research method, meaning case studies can most likely fit into any of your projects. So we're going to think about how a case study can fit into your project. So just as a refresher, the different grad groups within our section give toileting and interoception, playgrounds and inclusivity, splinting and OT students, and fine motor development and readiness for preschool and kindergarten. So just as a refresher, you might recognize this slide if you were paying attention. These are how to conduct a case study. So we have those 3 big steps, and the worksheet that we're going to do, we're going to chunk out this potential hypothetical case study within these 3 steps. So first, we're going to identify our potential case. We're going to choose an approach and collect data. Think about how we could collect data, because we can't actually. And then we're going to pretend to interpret data and think about the data we might get and how we would write a narrative and how this would enhance your projects. So step 1, I want you to think about your project. On your worksheet, you're going to state your research question that you had within your lit review. So would you keep your question the same as it was in your lit review, or would you kind of modify that in order to conduct a case study? What are your propositions? And if you remember from before, propositions are really just your hypotheses. What do you think you will gather from the case study? So kind of just to clarify this in relation to our grad group's product, our research question was, we kind of proposed that a child's participation in a sensory motor play group will improve a child's social, emotional, and social interaction abilities in the childcare setting. It will improve children's self-regulation abilities in the childcare setting, and it will improve parents' perceived confidence in effectively addressing challenging behaviors. So you can pause this video, and on your worksheet, as you identify the case, kind of fill out what your problem statement was, what your research question was, and what are your propositions or hypotheses. And another thing you can kind of think about are what boundaries of your case would be. So for example, ours would be within the connections classroom. Our relevant population would be preschool students ages 3 to 5. So kind of just think about that, pause, take a moment, and fill out that first part of the worksheet. Okay, welcome back. Step 2, we're going to choose our case approach and think about data collection. So if you remember, there's 2 different authors with 2 kind of approaches. So we have Stake's approach, which Julianne covered. So intrinsic, instrumental, collective. And then we have Yin's approach, where he first defines if he's going to do exploratory, descriptive, or explanatory case study. And after determining that, then you determine if you would like to do a single case or a multiple case. So if you're having a little bit of trouble conceptualizing this, the worksheet has a little definition next to each of those approaches, so it can kind of help you think through. But really think, are you trying to explain a general phenomena that can be aided by a case? Is this kind of a beginning step? Are you looking at a big picture? Is it an ambiguous question? Or is the case itself really important? Maybe are you looking at how do you even create an inclusive playground? Or are you looking at a specific OT student and how they use a splinting tree? Would your propositions be better answered with one case, or would it be better answered with multiple cases? So if you need more help, you can also rewind the video for greater detail, but we did include definitions of each approach on our worksheet. So kind of just take a moment and circle, just multiple choice, what you think would benefit you best. You can pause and then come back when you're done. Okay, finally, step 3, data collection. So although we don't really have actual data to analyze, we want you to conceptualize what information you might acquire through your proposed case study design. Then kind of think about how would this information aid your study design as part of an eclectic approach? How would this help the kind of study that you are presenting on? How would this information help you answer your original research question? And finally, we want you to explain why this case study would benefit or impede upon your original approach. Do you think it's going to hurt you, help you? Just your thoughts. And then just generally kind of think for yourself, why are case studies valuable to the OT process? And how is this valuable for my grad?
So now we're going to test how much you learned for this presentation. So the post-test, we did a pre-test, now the post-test. So again, this is going to be true or false. There's 5 questions. I'm going to go ahead and read them and you guys can pause and answer the question. Number 1, case studies are to always be specifically based on a singular case. 2, case studies are historically most recognized in the healthcare field. 3, case study data is strong in reality, but may be difficult to organize and pick the most important parts. 4, finding the case includes determining the object of the study and the research questions. 5, In case study research, hypotheses are also called theoretical propositions. Now I'm going to go ahead and go over the answers if you want to follow along. Number 1 was true. Number 1 was false. 2 was false. 3, true. 4, false. 5, true. And these are all our resources. And thank you for following along during this long video.